Joined by Brandon Marcello, 247 Sports. It's a great article. The 2023-24 coaching carousel, the trends, offensive coordinators on the move, etc. Brandon, thanks for your time with Craig and Paul. David Smoak as well. Was there something in particular that jumped out at you after watching or looking through all of these trends?
Well, there were several. Number one, I think a lot of people were wondering and kind of anecdotally on anecdotal evidence saying, hey, a lot of coaches are leaving college football and go to the NFL because they're tired of workload, the NIL, transfer portal. And it's somewhat correct. At least the data backs up that belief. We've had more coaches than potentially ever leave this year for the NFL. That's 34. That's a number that has been on the rise each of the last 2 years. We were at 18 coaches leaving for the NFL 2 years ago, and then 28 last year, and then 34 this year. Meanwhile, the amount of coaches coming from the NFL to college football has leveled off. So considering that the NFL's got less jobs available than 134 FBS teams, it's certainly something there that at least the data backs up that maybe some coaches are looking to get in the professional ranks. And of course, one would naturally say, well, it's a natural progression. It's a quote-unquote promotion, but more and more we're seeing a lot of coaches who are leaving for the NFL are some like support staff guys and position coaches who go on to the NFL for maybe, equal positions. They're not necessarily looking to become head coaches or even coordinators in the NFL.
Do you think this trend will continue, or do you think it's something that right now could be a blip until they, kind of get used to the way things are now?
I believe it's this trend will start ticking back down or at least leveling off here in the next 2 to 3 years. My belief is that once we have some sort of revenue sharing model in place for football players, that'll potentially, or not potentially, it will lead to more structure within the sport. And by that, I mean collective bargaining potentially, and then maybe even player contracts. Are they going to be employees or not? But most importantly, a lot of coaches out there believe that will probably not be as much movement of players from school to school. Now, why is that? Well, the possibility, and I'm not saying this is likely even, but the possibility that some players could be signing documents or contracts, whatever you want to call it, that say, hey, I'm giving you a 2-year deal, or I'm giving you a 3-year deal. All of this, of course, contingent on whether NIL actually goes in-house with some of these athletic departments, like we're seeing with some states like Virginia really pushing that across. And if that ends up happening, in addition to the revenue sharing piece, I think that would curb some of the workload for coaches as a result, because they wouldn't have to worry about players coming and going. And secondly, it would probably allow them to tighten up the transfer portal windows, and then also maybe some of the recruiting windows themselves, so they have more of a structured work schedule. Whereas it is now, they're pretty much working nonstop until the month of July, and that's when there's a dead period. But at that point, they're preparing as coaches for preseason camp and even some big recruiting visits in August. So there's really not a lot of downtime. And listen, a lot of us would say, including me, oh, boo-hoo, that's what the money's for. It's why you're getting paid lots of money, more than ever in the coaching industry. But still, they're human beings. And, some of them don't really care about the money. And that's why you're seeing them, one, either leave the NFL or other leagues, or some of them, quote unquote, taking demotions or going elsewhere within the sport. As we saw this year, we had 4 head coaches leave their jobs to go be assistants elsewhere in college football. So it's the context is king here, but what we're seeing is more and more coaches just kind of looking around going, I'm not sure I care all that much about the money as I do trying to find something that just makes me a little bit more sane.
Brandon, one of the bullet points that you had was that Big 12 assistants have the best job security. Can you explain that without trying to take thunder away from your article? Of course, everybody needs to go and read the article, but why do Big 12 assistants have the best job security?
Yeah, the average lifespan of a head coach in college football right now is 3 years going into this season. In the Big 12, it's 5.7 seasons, almost 6 seasons. And, of course, guys like Kyle Whittingham, who's coming in from Utah, of course, Mike Gundy, even Matt Campbell at Iowa State, they kind of help buoy that on the north end, of course. But you've got a lot of 4th, 5th, 6-year coaches in the league as well. I mean, you look at it right now, 9 of the conference's 16 head coaches have been there for at least 4 years. That's unheard of across major college football. What makes this even more interesting to me is that the Big 12 has been in more turmoil in this realignment era than any other power conference outside the Pac-12, which is no more entering this season. There have been teams coming and going each of these last 2 years, and they're adding 4 more programs this year, and yet they're adding programs which, for the most part, have some veteran coaches or have been there at least 2 to 3 years. Why is that? I think it's as simple as this. They got great coaches. I think make no mistake, there's a reason why a lot of people like me go into this preseason potentially and go, who's going to win the Big 12? I could say anyone but maybe 1 or 2 teams. I would circle on the calendar and go, you know what, that team has a chance to win the Big 12 championship this year. That's because of great coaches, a great level playing field in a lot of ways with the talent there. But at some point, right, you would think the bottom would fall out. We were projecting last year that the bottom could potentially fall out because there's going to be so much change in the league already by adding BYU and UCF and Cincinnati, and now adding even more. You wonder, okay, at some point, this much change leads to changes at the top of these programs. Look at the AAC. I know no one's paying attention to the AAC all that much, but going into last year, they were going under a massive change in membership themselves, and they had more than half their conference change head coaches, and they had some of the biggest staff changes on the assistant coaches schedule as well. And yet the Big 12 has managed to kind of go smooth sailing throughout all these troubled waters. I would think that after this upcoming year, when you've got coaches like Dave Aranda at Baylor, even maybe Sonny Dykes at TCU, not saying he's going to get fired, but maybe he's got some staff changes he could potentially have to make this year if they just struggle a little bit. Or even Colorado with Deion Sanders. Those are programs where if you're not kind of getting over the hump at this point, you could see some massive changes within those programs, and that would mean a lot more staff overhauls. But as it stands right now, man, the Big 12 over the last 3 years have had the least amount of changes in college football. And that really, I think, out of anything we've talked about, is the most staggering thing I pulled out from all of this. Because not only are they the lowest, but they're the conference with the most turmoil as far as membership.
Yeah, considering all the things that have happened with conference realignment. And so you mentioned Big Ten SEC coaches have the shortest career. Is that because the not the desire to win, but the pressure to win is higher?
Oh, absolutely. I think so. Also, when you look around in the Big Ten, the SEC, it's not just the head coaches. They fire coordinators at a whim there. And a lot of times in the middle of the season, and head coaches in the middle of the season. I mean, goodness gracious, Mississippi State fired their first year head coach before the end of the season. Arkansas fired their OC with like 3 or 4 games left in the season in his first year as the coordinator. Every year it seems like those are moves being made in the SEC or the Big Ten. And that just continues. The Big Ten had 87 changes this year. The SEC had 77. Not far behind. And, of course, those two conferences lead the way as far as changes. In fact, the next closest power conference is the Big 12, and they only had 50 changes overall and did so with more schools, so to speak, than the SEC, I should say, with all the movement they've had. So, but that'll continue, I believe, because this trend has been going on in the SEC and the Big Ten for the last 3 years as well.
Brandon, with the coaching salaries heading the way they are, I mean, Kirby Smart's at $13 million. Like that, coaching salaries are better in college, though, for a large part than they are in the NFL. Do you think that is something that might also help stave off the exodus?
No, I don't personally, because I don't think coaching salaries are going to balloon all that much more, if at all, with revenue sharing coming to the forefront. I think some of the big-time blue blood programs will continue to pay quite a bit. I mean, goodness gracious, anything over, $4 million is amazing pay in college football right now. But the outrageous numbers, I think those will only stick to maybe a handful, like 4 or 5 programs. But I think at this point, kind of what you're seeing with the salaries at the mid-tier power programs, I would think that those will probably level off here in the next couple of years before we get into the revenue sharing program, because these schools are going to be paying $15 to $25 million a year to players, in addition to potentially anything they're getting with their NIL, which could double that figure. And there's going to be a lot of hard decisions to be made here. One with, the ancillary sports, the ones who do not make money, of course. Could we see programs getting cut? I think that's very possible. But of course, the Title IX law, which has been around for half a century, that is going to be a major influence in all this. How does that get handled in the courts? It'll be fascinating to watch. But if you're pinching pennies already at some of these programs preparing for potential revenue sharing, and when that actually happens, I don't think you're going to see a lot of quote-unquote mid-tier power programs going out there and going, all right, we're going to pay a coach $7 million or $8 million a year. I think what you're seeing now, it's going to have to kind of steady off a little bit.
So the support staffers, you mentioned there's 106 promotions, and we know that the analyst jobs that exploded with Saban at Alabama. I know Texas added a bunch, and heck, I sometimes don't know how many a school might even have. Is that something that might get cut back to with the possibility or the inevitability of revenue sharing?
I don't think so. I think it's actually going to grow just a smidgen. And the reason why I say that is because if the NCAA ends up approving this rule that's been pushed for the last year of allowing unlimited on-field coaches, I think many programs are still going to add maybe a few more quote-unquote analysts. And by that, I mean, when we say analysts now, those are guys who just can't coach on the field, but they're helping behind the scenes with preparation and game film. Those guys, their new titles are going to be much like what we see in the NFL today. Assistant offensive line coach, assistant quarterbacks coach. They're going to have two guys pretty much at every position coaching a position. But I'll say this, talking to a lot of major college coaches, they don't expect and don't really want to expand their staffs beyond what they have already. They're just going to, quote unquote, bump up these analysts to these new titles and maybe add another coach or two. And as Matt Rule, the Nebraska coach, told me, and I've heard this from a couple other coaches, their approach is that we just want to keep our veteran position coaches we've got now and then kind of have a younger guy who's the assistant offensive line coach or assistant linebackers coach who, one, can be learning that system underneath that coach. So in case that coach leaves, they can get bumped up. And secondly, they can connect with the kids a little bit more in the meeting rooms and behind the scenes more so than on the field. So I don't think we're going to see a big balloon of new staffers. Doesn't mean, though, that there's not some program out there that's maybe thinking like Alabama did a decade or so ago with Nick Saban with analysts and goes, you know what, we're gonna hire 10 or 15 more guys. But for the vast majority, I don't think they will.
Do you feel like this offseason with Nick Saban, of all people, being the one that moves on, which kickstarted this domino effect that it seemed like it was never going to end, and then also with Harbaugh leaving, was this kind of a perfect storm, or is this still the norm?
This is still the norm because we already had nearly a record amount of changes before Nick Saban retired. We were also, pretty much believing that Jim Harbaugh was going to leave, and that ended up happening. There's going to be more dominoes as well there. But it certainly affected things. We saw 5 head coaches change in the time after Nick Saban retired. But at some point, he was going to retire anyway, right, in the next few years, and that was going to set off a huge domino effect. It did happen this year, and we had a record year with 31 head coaches, but I don't think this was necessarily a year that was outside the norm. I still think we're probably going to be around 25 to 30 changes every year at the top of programs, and the numbers have proven that out year after year after year. It's really been on the rise here, especially over these last 7 to 8 years.
So on the revenue sharing and all of that, we've had Mac Rhodes. He hadn't been on in a while. We have him on, I think, next week, but you now heard what Troy Dannon said. Mac Rhodes on our show mentioned revenue sharing. When is that, in your opinion, going to start? Will that still depend on what happens with that House versus NCAA lawsuit?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It depends mostly on that. And really what's going to be interesting is what type of model the two parties kind of come up with from that. And also a lot of these player associations that have been getting off the ground the last few months, they want a seat at the table in formalizing a revenue sharing model and having some player voices in that room to say, here's what we want. But in the end, the talk has always been among the associations of people I've talked to, They're going to want about a 20% share of media revenue. And it looks like the NCAA, in their discussions based off other reporting, I think from Yahoo Sports and ESPN, was something around 22%. So they're in the ballpark. They all have the idea of what this model is going to look like, but there will be a big push to try and get players involved in this settlement to formalize and formulate, I should say, what this model looks like. When will it be in place? I think it could happen as soon as this time next year in July of 2025 when we talk about the academic calendar. I think it could be in place that soon, though I would say they want to get this done quickly for the players. Maybe they put a temporary model in there as they develop what the finalized one will look like in 2026 potentially. But everybody I've talked to says that, including ADs and some of these player association folks, that they believe that we'll be sitting here in a year from now talking about what that model looks like and having it in place by the time July 1st, 2025 arrives.
Brandon, is there anything to be taken from the fact that the coordinators were right down the middle, even 60 offensive and 60 defenses, or is that just the way it is?
I think that was just luck. I think it was a flip of the coin. Yeah, I was shocked that it was 60-60. Every year it's one way or another. It has been since I've been tracking this. This year it was perfectly aligned. I think it was just one of those things that just happened that I wasn't quite expecting. But what the other trend I would say in this, I don't want to give my entire article away because
sure.
It's months and months of work. But the other thing is we're seeing, you've heard coaches talk about the portal killing high school recruiting and more often than not, junior college recruiting. I mean, when's the last time we heard about, well, the number one JUCO quarterback's going to so-and-so and they got a chance to win a national championship this year? That's not happening anymore. And it's also affecting coaches. So these coaches aren't going to recruit the JUCOs. So they're not being around the coaches and saying, hey, this guy's the next up-and-comer. We should look at him for this staff position we got come open. So look at this. I mean, I'm just guess how many JUCO coaches were promoted, so to speak, into the FBS this year.
Oh, I'm going to, okay.
20.
Yeah, okay. There's a number.
Okay. That's a good guess. Certainly. 0.
Brandon,
missed
you guys
it.
Guess a number.
Missed it by that much.
Yeah, missed it by 20. Wow.
So I mean, we're talking. Listen, just a year ago and years before that, it was about like 10 a year, 5 to 10 a year. Not happening anymore, guys. It has been slowly dwindling year after year since the portal's been around, and I think that's literally just one. It's recency bias because these coaches are around these other coaches, and also it's just you don't know who you don't know, right? And these coaches, these head coaches, aren't recruiting the JUCOs all that much anymore. So they're not getting in front of these other assistant coaches and getting an idea of who's the up-and-comers. So it's really hurting them quite a bit more. And also, along with that, the line that's connecting that, support staffer promotions. Those have been on the rise and also been pretty consistent year after year after year. Those guys are just keeping their own. They're bringing the grad assistants in, promoting them to analysts, and then those analysts end up becoming very young position coaches, even in the Power Five. It's really interesting to see how much the hiring practices have changed in just a short order of time. And a lot of it is because of the portal, because coaches just aren't simply on JUCO campuses anymore recruiting.
Yeah, the Cam Newtons of the world leaving Blinn Junior College for Auburn, just you don't hear about that. Of course, he was a once-in-a-lifetime type of guy, but you make a great point. I went to a JUCO, so that kind of concerns me a little bit, and I wondered about that.
Ole Miss took a few players out of the JUCO this year. I think they went through that. Of course, that's what Lane was doing. But, yeah, I mean, Brandon, it's different.
So much different. And, again, we've heard coaches talk about how it's affecting and it's hurting high school recruits, of course, especially during the season when they're finishing up the season. A lot of these kids, they don't blossom really into big-time players. You know, a lot of these 2 or 3-star guys, they look more like 4-star guys at the end of their senior season, right? But the coaches aren't really getting to see them all that much because they're focused more on the portal opening up in December and trying to figure out their quick fixes and getting ahead of the pack there. And that's really affected the evaluation of some really hidden gems out there on the high school level. And a lot of those kids are going, quote, unquote, to FCS as 2-star guys or 3-star guys that maybe should be getting bigger looks and better looks from college coaches. But everybody wants the big fix now because now it's available through the portal. It's just the way it is. It's the new way of the game. And it'll continue to be that way until they really maybe change the system once again, which again, I think that it's very possible that we see some of these things kind of curve back a little bit and we see some of these numbers drop, not just in the coaching carousel, but also just the amount of transfer portal kids each program's getting every year.
As you see on the screen, Brandon Marcello, 247 Sports, at B Marcello. I just put a link up to the article. Go read it. Subscribe if you haven't. It's really, really detailed. You said months. My last question is just a number. How long ago did you start trying to piece all this together? I can't even imagine the time.
The day pretty much David Braun got elevated to head coach at Northwestern. So last July. I got a spreadsheet and everything that I update every single day with a lot of tags and stuff like that, so I can keep up with. Well, this guy was a position coach in this type of conference in the group of 5. How successful have they been in the Power 5 or whatever? Where they've come from and all that. So a lot of data to keep up with, but it's a lot of fun because when you kind of spit it all out, like I did last week and worked on it and kind of comb through the details, you start seeing some of these trends that a lot of coaches anecdotally believe are happening, and then sure enough, you provide them the data, and it supports what they're saying.
Great stuff, Brandon. Absolutely phenomenal job. Thanks for your time, Brandon Marcello, 247 Sports, on the